Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Laura and this is Culture Nonsense, where we talk about scammers, cults, anti-MLM, or any cultural obsession that I want to talk about at the moment. Remember to like this video if you like it, subscribe to the channel if you'd like more content like this, and let me know any of your thoughts in the comments below. So today we're jumping back into my series covering the Elizabeth Holmes trial. And if this is the first time you're coming across my videos and you'd like to catch up, I'll link that playlist right up here. So jumping into what happened November 9th and 10th. Those are the 2 days that there were trial last week that we're talking about today. And first of all, something weird kind of happened. There were a lot of tech issues that delayed trial for about 2 hours, I think, Tuesday morning. So this is yet again another one of those examples where there have been kind of weird things that have happened that have delayed the trial, or kind of, there's been a misstep here or there with jurors being dismissed, the water main breaking and shutting down court for the rest of the week. I even had someone ask me if I thought there was, any type of conspiracy that had to do with this. And honestly, I don't think so. I think the things that have happened have all been so different. It just seems like, a big series of bad coincidences. However, we've been told that this week, November 15th through the 19th, there's going to be testimony all 5 days. So I might actually do 2 videos covering that stuff, because if I did one, it would probably be super long. And we've been told that the prosecution might actually rest their case during this week. So that means that they would be done calling witnesses, and it would be the defense's turn to call witnesses and kind of give Elizabeth's side of the story. So now that we've got some of that information out of the way, jumping into the testimony on November 9th, we heard again from Lynette Sawyer, who started her testimony at the end of week 9 of the trial. Very briefly, she talked about her time as the kind of part-time lab director at Theranos. If you remember, she had that kind of weird situation where she never went into Theranos, she never really met anyone or had that much information about what she was doing. She was just asked to sign a bunch of documents. And while the defense was questioning her, they talked a lot about how the situation might not actually be that weird. I guess they tried to establish that this type of contract work where you might be, a part-time lab director is not too odd, and that Dr. Sawyer testified she sometimes served as lab director for multiple companies at once. So Mr. Wade asked her, "You knew when you were doing this that this is going to be a temporary limited assignment, right?" And she said, "Correct." However, something that was a little troubling in her testimony is that she said she was not familiar with the company's proprietary technology, those nanotainers. Mr. Wade asked her what's a nanotainer, and she said, "I don't know." And so that was one of Theranos' hallmarks, the little tiny containers that would store the droplets of blood from a finger prick. In his cross-examination, Mr. Wade established that Dr. Sawyer signed off on hundreds of Theranos policies during her stint as lab director, including one that mentioned a nanotainer. So she testified that she sometimes tried to make changes to the documents before signing them by emailing Theranos about it. And if she ever tried calling anyone to discuss any problems or changes she wanted to see made, she said those changes were not made. So the defense is trying to say here, maybe cutting down on her credibility, saying, "You're talking about how, you weren't able to get XYZ from Theranos, but you're signing off on documents that mention a nanotainer and you don't even know what that is. So were you really doing your job correctly?" Furthering that shifting blame strategy they've been doing. Again, she testified that she was frustrated Theranos didn't give her a list of lab employees, and Mr. Wade asked, "Well, you only asked for the list once. Did you ever call? Did you ever do anything else?" And she said that she did not. And they also discussed an email where Sawyer agreed to extend her time at Theranos, which kind of undercuts her comments that she left over concerns about the lab, because there were talks about her, staying longer. And that really concluded her testimony. There wasn't too much. Before the next person testified, there was a lot of discussion about that database that was lost, and I believe I mentioned that in my first video. So if you're not familiar with this database, it was kind of something that could be really good for the prosecution's case, but they weren't allowed to bring it up. They were only allowed to bring it into questioning if someone else mentioned it. Basically, in the testimony for Lynette Sawyer, they mentioned the database, and so the prosecution is saying this opens the door for us to talk about that. I believe the decision was that they were supposed to come to an agreement about whether or not they were going to talk about it by Thursday of last week. And as of right now, I don't know what their decision is, so stay tuned to see if we get to hear more about this database. Another thing that was fought about is showing jurors this regulator's inspection report. Basically, this report from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, was really bad, and it did end up being admitted into evidence because our next person to testify, Dr. King-Shuk, talked about it a lot, and it was really one of the main reasons or one of the main duties he had after he was hired to address all the issues in this report. So I think it would have been very odd to have testimony from him if he weren't allowed to talk about this report because it was such a huge part of his job. So Dr. Das was the next lab director after Lynette Sawyer, and he had more traditional credentials. He was a board-certified pathologist, and he joined Theranos in December of 2015, I believe. So initially, he only commuted to Theranos headquarters about 1 day a week, and he wasn't there kind of all day, every day until March of 2016. And he said that by the time he joined, he wasn't actually aware of Theranos doing any tests on its own proprietary machines, which is another thing that's, again, kind of odd. So his testimony started a little bit slowly as prosecutor Robert Leach began laying the groundwork to introduce that CMS report from 2016. And when 4 pages of this report were put into evidence, the defense objected again, but the judge thankfully overruled it. And I say thankfully because it's very interesting. Dr. Das actually said that this report was not brought up when he interviewed. He said Elizabeth Holmes didn't mention that the company could be getting a detailed report soon of the deficiencies in the lab. And he agreed with prosecutor Robert Leach that he only learned about the CMS issues after he came on board. CMS issued its report to the company in January 2016, saying that Theranos Lab was not in compliance and could be putting patient safety at risk. So Dr. Das testified that his sole responsibility early on was really responding to the deficiencies that this report laid out. Dr. Das was working on the CMS audit while at Theranos, and he discussed this big statement of deficiencies, which was the report. It was 121 pages. So just all of the mistakes that were there, all of the things that were wrong. And apparently in January of 2016, when CMS sent Theranos a notice, it had the heading "Condition level deficiencies, immediate jeopardy" in all caps. So they even thought that it was a big issue. This was not an average amount of deficiencies for a lab. So because of all these issues, it actually turns out that the lab director, King-Shuk, said that it was his decision to void 2 years of results from the company's proprietary Edison device after he concluded that these instruments were not performing from the very beginning. So he said that the founder, Elizabeth Holmes, pushed back on his conclusions, offering what he called an alternative explanation about quality control issues, saying they were to blame rather than a problem with the device themselves. So basically blaming the people who were doing the testing instead of the devices that were doing the testing. He said that this reasoning did not make sense to him and that the validation data had no bearing on the QA program. He concluded that he found these instruments to be unsuitable for clinical use, and he testified about something called a 10x warning or 10 times warning. And that's basically when results come in either above or below the proper range 10 times in a row. And he says that Theranos continued to report patient results after the 10x warning, which is something they should not do, because if you get an inaccurate result more than 10 times in a row, or, an abnormal result more than 10 times in a row, it might be a clue that there's something wrong. So apparently this quality control issue that Elizabeth tried to push was given to CMS in a letter that Das signed, even though he didn't really agree with this point. I think he was just doing it because it was what Elizabeth wanted. And like I said, all of the tests from 2014 and 2015 were voided. However, even though that looks really bad, it could actually be a good point for the defense because it's something for them to point to and say, look, this is when Elizabeth was involved in the lab. At a point up until this time, it had been Sunny who was kind of in control of things. But when Elizabeth was in the driver's seat, she decided to make a good decision and void all of these tests. That was a really hard thing to do, but she did it because she wants to be transparent and she's a good leader, and she didn't know that all these mistakes were around. So it's an interesting point to bring up because, like I said, looks really bad because Theranos' devices were doing so poorly, but it could also be used as, well, they tried to fix it. Again, during this cross-examination, the defense built up Dr. Das's credibility and experience and contrasted that with Elizabeth, saying that, he had the credentials to run a lab, he had the experience, and kind of downplaying her knowledge and responsibility. Again, shifting blame. If shifting blame to Dr. Das doesn't work, they can shift blame to Sunny, who was in charge of the lab before Elizabeth during this time, or to Adam Rosendorf. They talked about how the lab was not well run, before Dr. Das came on board. I will say, while shifting blame is a strategy that a lot of defense use, it is a little bit messy, in my opinion, to try to shift it to all these different places. It makes it seem like they don't really have an actual explanation for it. They're just trying to fling things from Elizabeth as much as possible, and it doesn't really matter where it lands. So they're just saying it could be their fault, it could be their fault, anyone's fault but hers. And so in my opinion, it would make a little bit more sense maybe to choose one or two targets instead of saying it's literally everyone's fault besides Elizabeth's, because that's what they've done so far with every single lab director and every single investor. And speaking of investors, that's the next person who testified, Alan Eisenman, who was an investor from Texas, and he by far was the most emotional on the stand. Apparently, even before he took the stand, there was some fighting about his testimony because apparently someone heard him in the hall saying about, punishment of Holmes, and I guess there's an email that talks about most of his net worth being tied up in Theranos. It is true that he was really close to retiring when he put in his second investment, and he may have lost all of his money, so they may think he has some type of personal axe to grind, which could kind of go either way. If he is too emotional, he might not look good to the jury, or on the other hand, he could be really sympathetic. Kind of goes either way. It's a little bit dangerous to have a very volatile and emotional person on the stand. So interestingly enough, he first invested in 2006, I think. So he was told about Elizabeth when she was just first dropping out of school and starting her company. He invested more than $1 million in 2006, and he said he began speaking with Ms. Holmes directly about the company as he was deciding whether or not to invest. Echoing what we've heard from the other investors, Mr. Eisenman said that Elizabeth was his primary source of information when making his investment and that he had regular contact with her. So Mr. Eisenman recalled being told that significant revenue was in the company's future, including a projection of $200 million of revenue in 2008. And as we know, that didn't happen. Eisenman testified that he was also told in 2009 that Theranos was expecting demand for 1 million of its blood testing cartridges a month, which would grow to 2 million a month, and that the company could do multiple tests per cartridge for $30 each. So he said that these were numbers that sounded pretty astounding and create very significant value for the company. He was told that Theranos would be cash flow positive by around 2010, and he thought that that was tremendous news. So he also testified about a couple things that impressed him and kind of drew him towards investing. One of the big things was that Larry Ellison of Oracle Corp was an investor and a board member, an advisor to Elizabeth Holmes. Another was that, his understanding was that these international pharma companies had adopted this tech in some of their clinical trials. Also, again, that Theranos had contracts with a large number of these pharmaceutical companies, including Pfizer, which he said put an initial stamp of approval on his investment. And I'm assuming he's referring to that doctored report with the Pfizer logo, which we now know is a fraudulent document. And again, the other thing that was really valuable to him were those projections of revenue, which we also know were just way too rosy to be even close to possible. Theranos had zero or near zero revenue through early 2015 and internally forecast its first substantial revenue of about $113 million at the end of 2015, according to its financial documents that they submitted into the court record. It forecast about $200 million in revenue for 2016, 8 years after Mr. Eisenman expected it, according to the documents, and the company consistently lost money. So an interesting thing about this investor that we haven't seen with some of the others was that he was really persistent in trying to get information out of Elizabeth. Apparently, when he first decided to invest in 2006, he had direct contact with her, and she gave him personal quarterly updates on the company. Over time, Mr. Eisenman asked Holmes to keep her quarterly updates coming, and he was denied. He said that there was no information coming from the company, and to him, that was a real sign of trouble. So by 2010, there was an email that jurors saw in which Ms. Holmes said she couldn't give Mr. Eisenman the information he was asking for and suggested that he take the company's offer to buy out his investment at five times what he put in. Basically, I think just trying to get him out of the way because he was being so not obnoxious asking questions. I mean, he was just doing what anyone, might expect to do if they have all their retirement savings put into a company and you're not getting any information about it. But they just didn't want him to keep asking questions. Apparently in May 2010, he asked whether the company hit that $200 million revenue that it predicted for 2009. And in a later email, he testified that Ms. Holmes said that the goal was stretched to another year. He got the impression that Theranos management did not like that he was so proactive, and he felt he wasn't getting enough information about his investment. And from there, he actually reached out to Don Lucas asking for information, and Lucas forwarded this to Holmes, and she responded, "Alan, we have communicated about this multiple times before, yet you choose to continue going down this path." He responded, "It's been over 2 years since you have communicated with your investors. Does this mean that you can't or won't communicate with me or the other investors?" So, weird enough, despite his frustrations, he decided to invest again in 2013 because he was told by Ms. Holmes and Sunny Balwani that Theranos' technology was working and it was a growing market. So, his subsequent investment of about $100,000 in 2013 is actually one of the things that underpins one of the counts of indictment against Ms. Holmes. I guess he had a kind of on-again, off-again hostile relationship with Sunny, and we got some very interesting emails between the two of them. I guess he emailed Holmes and Balwani a negative UBS report about Theranos, and Balwani responded that it sounds like an uninformed consultant. And Eisenman responded asking for more info, and Balwani said, "Alan, I have no intention of responding to this email and explaining the tech and processes. Please stop sending me emails every day. Thanks." So as things got more contentious, I guess Mr. Eisenman started sending emails with the subject, "Please respond," in all caps with multiple exclamation points. And jurors saw yet another email exchange in 2015 in which Mr. Eisenman sought more information to decide if he should sell his shares, and it ended with a response from Sunny saying, "Your emails are insulting. Future emails will come from our counsel." So yeah, threatening potential legal involvement. Anyway, the last thing to talk about, as I said, was the fact that on the stand, Mr. Eisenman was very emotional. There were a lot of things that he said that had to be struck from the record because he was asking his own questions or kind of talking out of turn because the defense was trying to say, well, look, you signed some documents that, didn't make the promises that you're stating. And his whole argument was, well, what's more important, this boilerplate that is on here or the fact that I was having actual conversations with Elizabeth where she was telling me these things? Like, which thing am I supposed to value more? This little paragraph that says, these projections might not come to pass, or this founder who's telling me this is what we're doing, this is what's going to happen, these are our next steps. So he was getting very frustrated because the defense was trying to say, an investment is risky, you never know what's going to happen. And he was saying, I had direct contact with Elizabeth and she was telling me different things. The problem is those aren't the questions the defense is trying to ask. So he was kind of talking out of turn and not directly answering the questions that were posed to him, which is really just all he's supposed to do. The judge even admonished him at one point and, told him, just please simply answer the questions that are posed to you. And he said, I'm trying. Anyway, that's all for the update for today. We're going to catch up Honestly, I might put out a video on Friday talking about testimony from Monday and Tuesday this week. Thank you so much for watching another video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and let me know what you think in the comments below. Like the video if you like it, and subscribe if you'd like more of this content. I will see you guys in my next video, but until then, have a great day and bye.